The reason we know that dietary fat is very problematic for blood glucose control is very simple. If you go into the scientific research and you take a look at what researchers do to induce insulin resistance inside of both laboratory animals and humans, what you'll find is exactly what I found in 2007 when I first started my graduate degree, which is that in order to create insulin resistance, you don't feed animals and you don't feed humans sugar. You don't feed them fructose, you don't feed them glucose, you don't feed them refined sugar. You feed them dietary fat, especially saturated fat. When you do that, insulin resistance is very measurable and is created within a very short amount of time, oftentimes only a couple of weeks. So when I first learned this back in 2007, I was like, wait a minute, hold on. You're telling me that I can create insulin resistance by using fat? I thought it was all about sugar. I thought it was all about carbs. That doesn't make any sense.
Diabetes is our topic today. There's a lot of conflicting information out there. What causes it? Is there anything that can be done to prevent it? Can you reverse it naturally and without medication? Well, today we are talking to one of the leading experts on diabetes, a gentleman who has been living with type 1 diabetes and is the co-founder of Mastering Diabetes, helping thousands take back control of their blood sugar in a natural and healthy way. With that, we welcome my guy, Cyrus Khambatta, PhD, to the show. Cyrus, good to see you, man.
What's up, my man? It's good. So good to be with you, Chuck. Thanks for the invitation.
It's great to have you here on a new venue, a new outlet, as it were. For those who aren't familiar, the Montgomery Heart and Wellness crowd who are watching us here today, how long have you, Cyrus, been living with type 1 diabetes?
So I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes in the year 2002. So we're looking about 21 years ago. And I was actually diagnosed with 3 autoimmune conditions at the same time. The first one is Hashimoto's hypothyroidism. The second one is Alopecia universalis, which basically is just code for hair loss, total body hair loss. As you can see, I have no hair, I have no eyebrows, I have no eyelashes, no ear hair, nothing. And then the third one was type 1 diabetes. And all 3 of these autoimmune conditions set in within about a 6-month period, leaving me with a lot of questions and pretty much no answers. So it's been a very fun journey over the last 21 years. And I've learned an incredible amount of information that can help people transform their lives from the inside out.
You know, I didn't realize this until recently that when a person is diagnosed with one autoimmune disorder, their risk of developing a second or a third, is exponentially higher.
Agreed. And actually, that's what I was told when I was first diagnosed in the year 2002. And what happened was that I was actually developing a 4th autoimmune condition. It's called vitiligo. And vitiligo is basically like a skin discoloration that happens when there's specific regions on your skin that lose pigment. So on my arms, I started to notice these little white spots that were popping up all over the place. And I went back to my endocrinologist and I said, hey, what is this happening here? And he goes, hey, looks like it's your 4th. Chances are you're going to continue to increase the number of, you're at a higher risk for all other autoimmune conditions. And I was like, not good enough. And it was literally at that moment in time that I said, I'm out. I no longer want to communicate with the traditional allopathic medicine world because they don't have solutions. They just have explanations, and they definitely did not leave me with a good feeling.
So with an autoimmune condition, let's explore this a little bit. That's literally your body kind of attacking itself, and in your case, in 4 different ways.
Agreed. Yes. The term autoimmune basically refers to your immune system creating a dangerous environment for yourself. So the term auto basically means acting on self. And so autoimmune effectively means your immune system has been tricked into believing that there are specific cell types within your body that are dangerous, that can hurt your long-term health. And as a result of that, your immune system goes and it destroys those cells. In my particular case, when it comes to type 1 diabetes in the pancreas, there's a specific collection of cells known as beta cells. And the beta cells are the ones that are responsible for secreting insulin. So insulin is a very, very, very powerful anabolic hormone that's required in order to maximize blood glucose uptake from the blood and also to help grow cells, replicate cells, and grow tissues. And when you lose the ability to secrete insulin, it is a very, very disastrous problem for all tissues. So my immune system has been tricked into believing that my beta cells were dangerous to me. And as a result of that, my immune system went and it targeted the beta cells inside my pancreas and it killed almost every single one of them. I used to be able to secrete insulin. Let's say I had 100% normal insulin production. It went from 100% to about, I don't know, 60, 70, maybe 50 to 60% normal insulin production. And that's when my blood glucose started to rise significantly. That's when I got diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. And then over the course of the next couple of years, I went from 50 or 60% insulin production down to 0. That's where I sit today. When it comes to Hashimoto's hypothyroidism, that's basically an autoimmune condition of your thyroid gland. As you can see, I'm pointing down right here beneath my chin. And your thyroid gland basically, now this thyroid gland has antibodies that have been manufactured by my own immune system that have targeted specific regions of my thyroid gland for destruction. And as a result of that, my thyroid hormone output is now significantly lower than it was when I was younger. And then finally, when it comes to alopecia universalis, the hair follicles themselves have been targeted for destruction. So my immune system has gone in and basically found every single hair follicle and basically shut it down so that those hair follicles can no longer do their number one job, which is produce hair.
You know, and I was just talking with twin brothers recently who had alopecia. They, luckily for them, were able to reverse it. But just to hear them explain it, and then to come to the realization that with alopecia, it's far more common than a lot of us realize. 2% of the entire world's population is believed to have it to some extent. Nonetheless, I would imagine when you were diagnosed with it, especially still being a really young guy at that point, you must have felt awfully singled out, man.
For sure. I mean, I had no idea what was going on. I mean, I didn't have any answers at that time, way more questions than I had answers. And to go from having hair to not having hair is a pretty sharp transition in a short period of time. But here's the best part. I only had, I used to shave my head. So I had sort of like a number one buzz that was on my head. And I had just like a little bit of facial hair that would appear from time to time, depending on whether I wanted a mustache and a beard or not. But I never really had that much hair to begin with. So when I lost my hair, to go from having a number one buzz to a 0, and having, my entire scalp exposed as to having just a little bit of carpet or a little bit of astroturf, if you will, on the top of my head, it wasn't really that big of a change. All that had to change was that my head wasn't really tan. It didn't have a good color because it wasn't exposed to the sun. So as soon as it took, maybe like 2 weeks or so, and my head changed color, then at that point, I was the new me, and I looked exactly the way that I do now.
Yeah, upside though, I mean, you're saving a ton on the barber bills, aren't you?
I mean, I'll tell you this, it's literally one of my favorite things of all time. Like, there have been people who said, hey, there's this treatment that you can do that will actually significantly improve your hair growth. And every time I hear that, I'm like, I don't want it. I literally don't want hair, because I've saved money on shampoo and conditioner and haircuts and razor blades and aftershave, because I don't have to shave my chin anymore, my face anymore. I mean, it's incredible. I save a lot of money and I save a lot of time, and it just makes my life easier.
The silver lining, dude. And you pull it off. I mean, some people just can't pull off the look, but you do, man. You look tough.
Thanks, man. I appreciate it.
All right, let's turn our attention to diabetes, which is our main theme here of the day. So you mentioned that you have type 1 diabetes. For those who aren't familiar with the different types that are out there, what is the difference between your version of diabetes type 1 and then the more common one, which is more dietary and lifestyle driven, which is type 2 diabetes?
Good question. So we used to think, the scientific community used to basically have two different types of diabetes. There's type 1 and type 2. And over the course of time, there have been more types of diabetes. So you can think of it as we're an ice cream shop. There used to be two different types of ice cream, chocolate and vanilla. And now we have 7 different ice cream flavors. And those 7 different ice cream flavors are type 1 diabetes, type 1.5, pre-diabetes, type 2 diabetes, gestational diabetes, and type 3 diabetes. So I lied, 6 different types of diabetes. Okay. So there's a lot of different types, and we have to sort of categorize them and make sure we understand exactly what that means. So the simplest way to think about it, type 1 and 1.5 are basically both autoimmune conditions, just like we described. Your own immune system attacks your own beta cells, and that leaves you with limited insulin production or 0 insulin production. Type 1 usually affects people under the age of 30, and it's a very strong autoimmune reaction that gets you to 0 insulin production within about 1 to 2 years. Type 1.5 affects people over the age of 30, and it's just a slow progressing version of type 1 diabetes. So you can think of it as adult onset, slow progressing type 1 diabetes. When it comes to pre-diabetes and type 2 diabetes, these are the two forms of diabetes that affect more than 92% of the population. Okay, 92% of the diabetes population is living with either prediabetes or type 2. And those two conditions are actually started by another precursor condition called insulin resistance. So insulin resistance starts. Insulin resistance then causes your blood glucose to start to get elevated. When your blood glucose becomes a little bit elevated, that means that you now have a warning sign that there's a problem. And that warning sign is called prediabetes. So you can think of prediabetes as basically just being like a flag that your body throws up and says, hey, by the way, things are moving in the wrong direction. You might want to pay attention. So prediabetes happens when your blood glucose becomes elevated. And then if you don't correct that problem and you become more insulin resistant over the course of time, then prediabetes turns into type 2 diabetes. And when that happens, you now are living with very high blood glucose. And that is what majority of all people living with diabetes now have. Now, here's the best part. The traditional medical world used to believe that it was a one-way street to go from insulin resistant to prediabetes to type 2 diabetes. But now there's plenty of research that demonstrates that it's actually a two-way street, meaning you can move in one direction towards type 2 diabetes. And in most cases, you can actually turn in the opposite direction and go all the way back to a non-diseased state. So if you are living with type 2 diabetes, you can move from that back to prediabetes, and then from prediabetes back to insulin resistant, and then from insulin resistant back to normoglycemic, meaning ideal blood glucose control, non-diseased. The question is, how are you going to do that? The only way to do that is to get rid of the underlying condition, which is called insulin resistance. And we'll talk about that in more detail. But if you can become insulin sensitive using your food and your movement patterns and your overall lifestyle, then you can move in the opposite direction and go back to the non-disease state. Gestational diabetes is another form of diabetes that affects women who are pregnant. They usually find out somewhere around the 28 to 30 week marker. And that's their first, most of the time, it's their first opportunity to ever learn that they have a metabolic dysfunction. So you can think of gestational diabetes as being a temporary form of diabetes that affects women in the last trimester. And women have an opportunity to change their lifestyle so that they can protect the health of themselves as well as their baby. Now, here's the best part. Women can actually reverse gestational diabetes. Again, the traditional medical world does not know that this is even possible. But if you take the right lifestyle measures and you can, within a very short period of time, lower your blood glucose and get rid of gestational diabetes altogether. And by doing so, it's three things. Number one, you protect the health of mom. Number two, you protect the health of baby. And number three, you protect the health of mom and baby after the baby is born. And that means that the mom's risk for developing type 2 diabetes later in life comes way down. And the baby's risk for developing type 2 diabetes later in life also comes down. So it's critically important for a mother who's living with gestational diabetes to act fast because there's a sense of urgency. And to do that is actually not that hard, and it makes a massive difference. Finally, the last thing I'll say is that there's another one called type 3 diabetes. Type 3 diabetes is basically insulin resistance of your brain. Insulin resistance of your brain can translate into dementia in your older ages, and then it can translate into Alzheimer's disease in certain cases. So when your brain is negatively impacted by the same insulin resistance that causes type 2 diabetes, your brain takes an impact. You can't feel that impact necessarily today, but you will feel it 20, 30, 40 years into the future. And so it's very important to understand that the stuff that you do to your body, the food you eat, the amount of exercise you perform, and your overall lifestyle absolutely matters for controlling your blood glucose, but it matters more for preventing the eventual cognitive decline that can happen many years into the future.
You cool to take a couple of minutes and explore the type 3? Because for a lot of people, this is kind of emerging science. So my first question about that would be, if a person has had type 2 diabetes for a number of years, what do we know currently in terms of their overall risk for developing Alzheimer's or dementia? You said that it's higher, but is there a way to quantify that risk?
It's a good question. So I don't know off the top of my head what the actual risk increase is. And so I would have to dig up a little bit of papers inside of the medical research to find out what is that number quantitatively. But one thing I will tell you from a biological perspective, the reason that it happens is because traditionally speaking, scientists used to believe that insulin resistance only affected your liver and your muscle. So if you look into the research, what you'll find is that the overwhelming majority of all papers that talk about diabetes and insulin resistance talk about your liver and talk about your muscle, because those are the two very active metabolic tissues inside of your body that's basically below your head that are negatively impacted by the insulin resistance pathology. And so insulin resistance effectively is a self-defense mechanism that both of those tissues initiate in order to limit the amount of fuel that is coming into them. And by doing that, they end up trapping glucose in your blood and causing your blood glucose to go high. So this is detrimental to your cardiovascular system. It's detrimental to your kidney. It's detrimental to nerves in your peripheral tissues, all the way in your fingers and your toes, because the nerve damage can result in what's called peripheral neuropathy, which can be very painful. But the best part is that over the past 15 to 20 years, scientists have figured out that not only does insulin resistance affect your liver and your muscles, causing problems inside of your, from neck down, but it also translates up into your central nervous system. And what ends up happening is that the blood-brain barrier is negatively impacted by a high glucose environment. So lots of glucose in your blood pisses off every tissue in your body that you can think of: your liver, your kidneys, your heart, your vasculature, your muscles, your sexual organs, your thyroid gland, your spleen, your pancreas, your eyes, your brain. Every single tissue gets annoyed when your glucose level is high. And when your brain is negatively impacted, your brain has mechanisms that prevent you from feeling it right here and right now. But again, if you translate fast forward into the future, 20, 30, 40 years from now, the ability of you to think clearly, the ability for you to have spatial awareness, to have clear speech, and the ability to think quickly about, problems that you foresee or that you see in your daily life goes down significantly. And as a result of that, people who have cognitive decline into the future end up losing their memory and end up having a, worsened spatial recognition. And as a result of that, it can translate into a very, very, very debilitating condition called dementia.
And I know that there are people who are studying this right now, Dr. Dean Ornish, one of them, looking at what the potential for a major dietary shift in people with early onset dementia, early onset Alzheimer's. Is it possible to reverse that in the same way that we've seen heart disease being able to be reversed? We've seen type 2 diabetes being able to be reversed. And I'm not trying to put you on the spot, just asking kind of for a hypothesis based off of what it is that we know now, how those other diseases function, and the similarities that they have with Alzheimer's disease. Just a hypothesis. I mean, what is the probability that we could see a major impact of having wholesale diet changes actually improving somebody's outlook if they're diagnosed with dementia or Alzheimer's?
Okay, it's a phenomenal question, and I'll preface it by saying I don't know the answer to your question. If I had to give you a hypothesis, I would say that making significant changes to your dietary habits and making significant changes to your lifestyle that make you significantly more insulin sensitive, aka reversing insulin resistance, we know without a shadow of a doubt that has a profound impact on your blood glucose values, on your cholesterol level, on your triglyceride values, on your LDL cholesterol values, and beyond. So from a metabolic perspective, it has tremendous power at helping you reverse many cardiovascular disease conditions, as well as diabetes, as well as many forms of cancer. Now, it is very logical to believe that the same improvement that you can get in your metabolic health in your peripheral body will also happen inside of your brain. So I'm not going to go so far as to say that if you already are living with dementia and or Alzheimer's disease, that you can reverse that using this methodology. I'm saying there's a very high likelihood, extremely high likelihood, that you'll see significant improvements. And if you could reverse it, I think that's a Nobel Prize right there, as far as I'm concerned, because dementia affects an increasingly large number of people on the planet today. And it's becoming one of the most costly diseases that we have in our world. So if this is truly a reversal mechanism, that could be one of the most powerful discoveries of the modern world.
Yeah. I often wonder about that because my mother-in-law has now pretty advanced Alzheimer's. And there's a part of me that almost every single day wonders, what if that would happen? And in talking with experts in that field, neuroscientists, neurologist, there's obviously ethical, concerns and considerations to be taken into account in conducting a study like that. Like the patient's life is already kind of turned upside down. And then if you were to change something else, make even another thing less familiar, I mean, that's as fundamental as a diet. That could be problematic, so what's the ethics there? But I do hope that we're able to get some answers in the future. But let's table that discussion for the time being and shift back to what I think is going to be the heart of our conversation today, and that is diabetes and the causes of it and, what the average person without Alzheimer's, without dementia can do to improve their blood glucose and get that blood sugar under control. This has kind of been the great debate in nutritional circles of late. You have one camp, the traditional camp, who is still banging the drum and saying sugar and carbs are bad. They are absolutely the enemy. They are what causes diabetes. There's this other camp with emerging mountains of research to back them up that shows it's not necessarily the sugar, it's not necessarily the carbs, but it's the fat in a person's diet that is truly driving our diabetes epidemic. Which camp do you fall in?
Man, how much time do you have? That's the question.
As much as you can spare, my man.
You're right. This is one of the hottest scientific debates that exists in this world today. And in my mind, it is unnecessary. This should not be debated. And the reason I say this should not be debated is because there is conclusive scientific proof that dietary fat, specifically saturated fat, is the most problematic, is the single component in your food that increases your risk for diabetes more than any other component in your food. This has been proven over and over and over again. But yet, despite that, there's a whole bunch of influencers on social media who still don't believe it. They don't want to believe that it is a true statement. And this helps fuel a lot of the debate. Now, I like to think about biochemistry because I think it's one of the greatest subjects of all time. So let's talk about the biochemistry. And then by understanding the biochemistry, you'll start to understand why saturated fat is really the number one problem. The camp that believes that carbohydrates are the problem, their story is very straightforward. They say, when you eat carbs, I don't like that word. I'm going to refer to them as carbohydrate-rich foods. But when you eat carbohydrate-rich foods, it causes your blood glucose to go up. And that's a bad thing. And when your blood glucose goes up, then your pancreas has to work harder and make more insulin, and that's a bad thing. And when your pancreas has to make more insulin, then that means that your tissues become insulin resistant because they don't like a lot of insulin. And then that's what creates insulin resistance, which then creates diabetes. So they're saying carbs are bad. They raise your blood glucose, that raises insulin, that causes insulin resistance, and then that sets the stage for type 2 diabetes. Now, there are many things wrong with that logic. And before I, go into detail about that, let me tell you about how it actually functions, because it'll help you recognize that this methodology that I just described confuses the symptoms for the cause, and it's all jumbled and it's all backwards. It doesn't make any sense. The real way to think about blood glucose elevations is to start with dietary fat. Okay. The reason we know that dietary fat is very problematic for blood glucose control is very simple. If you go into the scientific research and you take a look at what researchers do to induce insulin resistance inside of both laboratory animals and humans, what you'll find is exactly what I found in 2007 when I first started my graduate degree, which is that in order to create insulin resistance, you don't feed animals and you don't feed humans sugar. You don't feed them fructose, you don't feed them glucose, you don't feed them refined sugar. You feed them dietary fat, especially saturated fat. When you do that, insulin resistance is very measurable and is created within a very short amount of time, oftentimes only a couple of weeks. So when I first learned this back in 2007, I was like, wait a minute, hold on. You're telling me that I can create insulin resistance by using fat? I thought it was all about sugar. I thought it was all about carbs. That doesn't make any sense. But then when I delved deeper into the actual biological mechanism, it became very clear. The reason it happens is because when you consume dietary fat, the fat is locked up in a molecule known as triglyceride. Triglyceride is the storage form of fat inside of your body, inside of all mammalian species, and inside of nature. So fat in a storage form equals triglycerides. You eat triglycerides in the form of chicken, fish, meat, dairy products, eggs, bacon, also fat-rich foods from the plant-based world like avocados, nuts, and seeds, and coconuts, and olives, and beyond. So fat is very easily findable, but whether you're getting it from the animal-based world or whether you're getting it from the plant-based world, the foods that you consume contain fat. Those triglyceride molecules that are in those foods end up getting chomped on by your teeth. They end up traveling down your throat into your esophagus and then eventually get inside of your stomach. Your stomach is basically an acid reactor. Inside of your stomach, you have hydrochloric acid that's secreted by the walls of your stomach. And the hydrochloric acid begins to sort of soften up the food a little bit and start to unfold it from its native, conformation that you find it in nature. Eventually, it gets inside of the next compartment, which is your small intestine. Your small intestine is where the bulk of all nutrient digestion occurs. Your small intestine is a container, and that container receives enzymes, digestive enzymes from your pancreas and digestive enzymes from your liver, and it manufactures its own digestive enzymes as well. So you have three tissues that are making digestive enzymes that are putting it directly into the small intestine. In the small intestine, you have food that is partially digested that has to be cut from long pieces, very long, big chain molecules that are protein and carbohydrate and fat predominantly. And they have to get cut by these molecular scissors into shorter pieces. And then those shorter pieces have to get cut again into individual building block units. So the triglyceride is the fat. The triglyceride basically gets cut and the glycerol molecule goes away and the fatty acids, 3 fatty acids, end up getting absorbed through the walls of your small intestine. They end up inside of your blood and they end up in these particles known as chylomicron particles. The chylomicron particles are these little tiny spaceships. There are literally trillions of them that are floating around in your blood. And the purpose of the chylomicron particle is to absorb fat directly from your intestine, from your digestive system, stick it into a vehicle, and then transport that vehicle all throughout your body, and then deliver those fatty acid molecules somewhere else. It doesn't matter. Just get it out, get it to a tissue. The ideal destination for those fatty acid molecules is your adipose tissue or your fat tissue. Now, your fat tissue exists all over the place. It's a very diffuse tissue. It means that you can have fat tissue inside of your chest. You can have it in your shoulders. You can have it in your triceps. You can have it in your abdomen. It can be inside of your butt. It's all over the place. A lot of people have, fat that's inside of their neck. Some people have it inside of their cheeks. It depends on your particular body, but the fatty acid, you think of the adipose tissue as basically being like a Costco warehouse of fatty acids. So these chylomicron particles, they go and they start delivering these fatty acids to the adipose tissue. And that is a good thing. It is a good thing because that's where they belong. That is the right place to keep them. That is the enzymatically perfect place for them to go. It is a mechanically perfect place for them to go. The problem happens when there's a lot of fat coming in from your diet because you decide that carbohydrates are bad for you. So you're eating lots of chicken and fish and red meat and olive oils and avocados and nuts and seeds, and you've decided that you're going to be eating a lot of fat-rich food. In a short period of time, you end up putting a lot of fat into these chylomicron particles. The chylomicron particles try to stuff as much as they possibly can inside of your adipose tissue, but then they end up spilling over some of those fatty acids elsewhere. And the elsewhere is what matters. The elsewhere is your liver and your muscle. So the chylomicron particles start putting fatty acids inside of your liver and start putting fatty acids inside of your muscle. And that would be okay as long as the total amount of fat that got into your liver and muscle was very small, because it was designed to only accumulate very small amounts of fat. But if you're eating a high fat diet, then what ends up happening is that a lot of fat gets put into your liver and a lot of fat gets put into your muscle. And that's where the problem begins. Now, your liver and muscle receive a whole collection of fat from these chylomicron particles. And they're like, man, I didn't ask for this. This is beyond my biological design. What am I going to do? How am I going to protect myself against this continuing to happen in the future? So what it does, both tissues initiate a mechanism to try and block more energy from coming into the tissue. Because what they're trying to do is they're trying to slow down the energy absorption process. And they say, okay, cool. If we can do something that will limit the amount of fatty acids that come into this tissue, then we can slow down this process. And so the most powerful thing that they can do is basically tell insulin to go away, or basically, in other words, stop responding to insulin effectively. Because insulin's job is to come around and knock on the door of tissues and say, knock, knock, there's stuff in the blood. There's glucose, there's amino acids, there's fatty acids. Do you want them? Because if you want them, they're available. Go take it up now. So if the tissue basically decides that it is not going to pay attention to insulin very effectively, then the tissue can block more stuff from coming in. Again, a self-defense mechanism. So these tissues initiate insulin resistance, insulin rejection, insulin blockade, however you want to refer to it. And they basically block fatty acids and amino acids and glucose from coming into the tissue. They don't fully block it, they just severely reduce it. And so as a result of that, the next time you eat something that's carbohydrate rich, like a banana, literally one single piece of fruit, it could be a banana, it could be a small bowl of chickpeas, it could be a peach. You have one small bolus of carbohydrate or one small meal of carbohydrate. And before you know it now, the glucose from those carbohydrates tries to get inside of your liver and muscle, but your liver and muscle are already playing insulin resistance. And so they say, no, I don't want you in here because I don't want to pay attention to insulin. I have to stop stuff from coming inside of me because I am full. Get out of me. And so as a result of that, the glucose from these carbohydrate-rich foods is trapped inside of your blood. So what people who eat a high-fat diet always experience, people who eat a ketogenic diet, a carnivore diet, a low-carbohydrate diet, they all say the exact same thing, which is that the moment they start beginning to eat carbohydrate-rich foods, they can literally watch their blood glucose rise to very high numbers within the first 30 minutes to 60 minutes of eating that meal. And they confuse that with the fact that they think that carbohydrates are bad for them. So what they've actually done is they've eaten themselves into an insulin resistant state by eating fat rich foods for many days, weeks, or months prior to then trying to eat carbohydrate rich food. As soon as they put that carbohydrate rich food into their mouth, their glucose goes high and they blame the carbohydrate and they say, bad banana, bad potato, bad peach, bad chickpeas. You're not good for me because when I put you into my mouth, my blood glucose goes high and I can see it on my blood glucose meter. So then what do? They put the carbohydrate rich foods away and they eat more fat, exacerbating the problem. The real way to get out of this problem is to basically recognize that, number one, carbohydrates are not the enemy. They are just a messenger. Okay. The chickpeas are not bad for you in any way, shape, or form. The chickpeas are very nutrient dense and actually phenomenal for you. The problem is you couldn't metabolize the carbohydrate energy from the chickpeas because of the traffic jam that you caused by eating all the fat prior to that. So the way to reverse this is to basically reduce your total fat intake from your overall diet and get it down from, let's call it 50% total fat down to 15% total fat, 10 to 15% total fat. And when you put it in that range, then your liver and muscle tissue have an opportunity to oxidize or burn, if you will, the fatty acids that are already inside of them. And they start to get rid of that energy. They start to burn it for energy, turn it into ATP, and it starts to, the storage amount goes from being very large to being very small. And before you know it, now your liver and muscle say, you know what? This whole insulin resistance game, I don't need to play this game anymore because I'm not trying to block anything else from coming in this tissue. I am in a much more metabolically advantageous situation right now. So let's allow insulin to do its thing on us. So they get rid of the insulin resistance game. And then next time you eat carbohydrate rich foods, the glucose can easily get inside of your liver and muscle. Your blood glucose is very well controlled and you set yourself up for long-term success with ideal blood glucose control. I'm going to stop talking. Does this make sense in any way, shape, or form?
It does. But the question that I have is, I mean, you mentioned saturated fat, and I'm wondering in terms of our conversation here, whether unsaturated fats operate in the same way. How does the body treat them differently than in this case?
Okay, great question. So the reason why we single out saturated fat as being more problematic than unsaturated fat is very simple. The research demonstrates that saturated fat is the single most potent trigger for the insulin resistance cascade that I just described. Okay, there are papers that are written by Jared Schulman over at Yale University, and he demonstrated without a shadow of a doubt the exact mechanism of exactly which player hits which domino that does which what, how to initiate this biochemical pathway that then causes insulin resistance. And the very top of that pathway is saturated fat. You put saturated fat into the top of the insulin receptor and all of a sudden everything goes wrong underneath it. Now, the reason for that is because saturated fat is a storage form of fat. In other words, it's an energy deriving form of fat. In other words, what that means is that when you take saturated fat and you put it into a cell, the cell locks it up into a triglyceride molecule like we talked about earlier. And that triglyceride molecule is there to be turned into ATP or energy at some point in time. It could happen tomorrow. It could happen 2 months in the future. It could happen 6 years into the future. But the fact of the matter is the saturated fatty acid, which is a linear molecule, is locked up in a triglyceride because it can be converted into ATP. And that's a good thing. It is energy. But unsaturated fatty acids do not behave the same way. Unsaturated fatty acids are no longer linear molecules. They have a carbon-carbon double bond in the middle of them, which means that they go from being a flat molecule to a bent molecule. And when you bend a fatty acid, you completely change its personality. It no longer is an energy storage mechanism. It no longer is used to generate ATP. Instead, that unsaturated fatty acid is now used for many other things. It's used for anti-inflammatory purposes. It's used to be put into the membrane of the cell to help assist in membrane fluidity, to allow nutrients to get transported between the blood and the intracellular environment. And depending on how many carbon-carbon double bonds are inside of that unsaturated fatty acid, you can change the personality again. Sometimes they're called omega-6 fatty acids. Sometimes they're called omega-3 fatty acids, and it can get very complex. So without going into too much detail about exactly all the different personalities, just note that a carbon-carbon double bond inside of an unsaturated fatty acid completely changes the way it behaves. It is no longer used for energy. And as a result of that, it behaves in other pathways. And the saturated fatty acids are the ones that negatively impact the insulin receptor. Does this make sense?
It does. And so now we've talked about the two different kinds of fat. Let's talk about the different kinds of sugars. We've got the simple sugars, and now we've got these complex sugars that are found in whole foods. You're somebody who has lived with type 1 diabetes now for many years, and I know that you do not go a single day without eating at least a mango. Odds are a case of mangoes. You are a mango machine. So clearly fruit is still part of your diet, but the majority of people who are living with diabetes, type 1 or otherwise, are still told to avoid fruit. So simplistically break down for us how the body handles those complex carbohydrates, those natural sugars, versus the refined stuff that you would find that comes packaged with, say, a donut or a sweet tart or something like that.
Very good question. Very good question. So the way that I like to think about this is there's basically two different types of carbohydrate energy. There's whole carbohydrate energy and there's refined carbohydrate energy. As the name implies, whole means it's a form of carbohydrate energy. It's a carbohydrate-rich food that came from nature. It is either grown on a plant or grown on a tree or found in the ground. Okay. And that's pretty much where every single carbohydrate-rich food in nature is found. You can take these foods and you can either eat them raw, or you can heat them up and cook them with minimal processing, or you can dehydrate them and then pressure cook them, as an example, in the case of beans and lentils, in order to make them edible. So either way, they're foods that you can either eat in an unprocessed state or a minimally processed state in order to derive nutrition out of them. Those are whole carbohydrates. The refined carbohydrates are basically carbohydrate-rich foods that had to go through a very significant manufacturing process to go from being a raw food all the way into a food that you find in a package in a grocery store. Refined carbohydrates live in the center of the grocery store. They come in bottles and packages and cans. And they're the ones that when you read the nutrition facts label, you're like, I don't even know how to pronounce half of these words. What the heck are these things? They're the aspartames, they're the maltodextrins and the sucraloses of the world, where you read them and you're just like, wow, I don't even know what these things are, right? So a simple way to think about it is that when you eat whole carbohydrates are foods that are actually three-dimensional matrices. What the heck is a three-dimensional matrix? Here's what it is. It's a food that contains 9 classes of nutrients. And I'm going to list them all. Number 1, carbohydrate. Number 2, fat. Number 3, protein. Carbohydrate, fat, protein, your 3 macronutrients. You can derive energy from these and turn these into ATP, just like we talked about earlier. Carbohydrate, fat, protein. Those are the first 3. The next 6 are micronutrients. You don't get any energy out of micronutrients, but they are there to serve other purposes. They have very potent disease-fighting characteristics, and they also have slightly different mechanisms that are not designed to give you ATP. And they include vitamins, minerals, fiber, water, antioxidants, and phytochemicals. So again, start at the top. Carbohydrate, fat, protein, vitamins, minerals, fiber, water, antioxidants, and phytochemicals. 9 classes of micronutrients. Every whole food that you can think of has all 9 classes of micronutrients. Chuck, lightning round. Give me 5 whole foods that you can think of off the top of your head right now.
5 whole foods?
Yeah, just name them.
Sweet potatoes, bananas, grapes, apples, and why don't we throw in asparagus just for grins?
Sweet potatoes, bananas, grapes, apples, and
asparagus.
Asparagus. Boom. All 5 of those. Did you know all 5 of those have all 9 classes of macro and micronutrients?
I do now, my friend. I absolutely.
Great. I dare you the rest of the time to think of one whole food that doesn't contain all 9. And the answer is you won't be able to find one because it doesn't exist. It doesn't matter what you're thinking of. It could be a fruit. It could be a vegetable. It could be a legume. It could be a whole grain. It doesn't matter. It could be a mushroom. It could be a leafy green vegetable, a non-starchy vegetable, nuts, seeds, avocados. I don't care. All of these foods contain all classes of nutrients, and that's a good thing. Now, what that means is that when you eat those foods, again, we talked about your teeth grinded up, it gets inside of your esophagus, inside of your stomach, starts to get partially digested, then it gets inside of your small intestine. Your small intestine, again, is where the bulk of all nutrient digestion occurs. If there is a lot of the stuff inside of your small intestine is going to require time in order to process it, and time is your friend. Always. Time is always, always, always your friend in the digestive process. So the fact that there are 9 classes of nutrients means that when those foods get inside of your small intestine, they take time to digest and absorb and transport. And that's a good thing, because when it comes to the carbohydrate that most people are afraid of, what they don't realize is that because fiber is present, fiber acts as a brake and it slows down the entire process. So most people think, oh, well, if I eat a banana, my glucose is going to spike. In reality, your glucose doesn't spike from a banana. Your glucose might rise, but your glucose is going to rise at a physiologically normal rate, and then it's going to peak, and then it's going to come right back down over the course of the next 2 hours. That is exactly what's designed to happen. The same thing happens when you eat black beans. The same thing happens when you eat quinoa. The same thing happens when you eat sweet potatoes or apples or asparagus, just like you talked about. All of these foods create a physiologically normal blood glucose rise and blood glucose fall, and that is totally normal. If we switch over to talking about refined carbohydrates again had to go through a manufacturing process of milling and grinding and cutting and dehydrating and bleaching and reconstituting, and eventually you get to a refined, oftentimes artificial end product, artificial sweetener. So in the case of white table sugar as an example, white table sugar is known as sucrose, and sucrose basically is just glucose plus fructose bonded to each other. So if we were to go through the same puzzle and try and figure out how many classes of nutrients exist in the end product known as white table sugar, I'll tell you this. It contains carbohydrate, because carbohydrate is is sucrose. Okay, that is a carbohydrate. Does it contain any protein? No. Does it contain any fat? No. Does it contain any vitamins? 0. Minerals? 0. Fiber? 0. Water? 0. Antioxidants? 0. Can I raise this one? There we go. Phytochemicals? 0. So effectively, you took a food that started out as sugar beets, or you took a food that started out as sugar cane that had all 9 classes, and you put it through a manufacturing process, and you got rid of so many different classes of nutrients, and you ended up with just one nutrient by itself, and that is carbohydrate, aka in this particular scenario, sucrose. So you take that, you put it in your mouth, it goes down into your small intestine. Now your small intestine goes, oh, there's nothing blocking me from absorbing this thing really quickly. So it takes the sucrose molecule, it puts one cut in the middle, turns it into glucose and fructose, sucks it into your blood, and then lets it go down its merry way. You know what happens in that scenario? Well, your blood glucose is going to rise pretty darn quickly. Your glucose is going to rise quickly because there was nothing slowing it down in your digestive system. There was no break. There was no fiber. There was no vitamins, minerals, carbohydrate, protein, fatty acids. Nothing was slowing it down. And as a result of that, it got inside of your blood, and it caused your blood glucose to rise relatively quickly, and most likely higher than the whole food counterpart. So when people have this fear of carbs, it drives me bonkers, because carbs are not the enemy. Refined carbohydrate will cause your blood glucose to do very strange things. Whole food carbohydrate in a low-fat environment will cause your blood glucose to do very normal things, and your blood glucose will respond exactly as your glucose metabolism was designed. So I want people to really understand that carbohydrate energy is not bad for you. Carbohydrate energy can be bad for you in 2 scenarios. Number 1, when your total fat intake is high, and number 2, when your carbohydrate quality is low. If you can eat high quality carbohydrates, aka whole carbohydrates, and you can do it in an environment where you're only consuming between 10 and 15% of total calories as fat, I guarantee you without a shadow of a doubt that your glucose metabolism will recover, and it will become so good that you will be able to eat large quantities of carbohydrate without anything negative happening to your blood glucose. Does this make sense?
It does. So let me ask you this, though, because when you were talking about the carbs kind of being in the middle of the grocery store, obviously there's a juice aisle. But what if somebody were to just buy a bunch of oranges and make fresh squeezed orange juice at home by themselves? You're talking about the most minimal processing there.
Yep.
You know, how does that compare to just an orange flavored drink that they might get in a bottle in the middle of that store?
Cool. So I'm going to say that there's actually 3 different ways to consume that orange. Number 1, you can eat the orange as an orange. Number 2, you can juice it into fresh squeezed orange juice like you described. Or number 3, you can buy orange juice that comes prepackaged that might have other stuff inside of it. In order of my recommendations, I would say number 1, eat the whole orange. Number 2, juice it fresh squeezed. And then number 3, buy the prepackaged orange juice. Okay. The reason I say that is because the whole orange contains all 9 classes of macronutrients and micronutrients, just like we described. And that, again, is going to elicit the most natural digestive biochemistry that you can find. When you juice the orange, you end up removing majority of the fiber from that orange. And removing the fiber is a problem, because it's going to increase the speed at which that orange juice is now absorbed into your blood. So we talked earlier about the fact that fiber is a brake. Fiber is incredibly important for many reasons. Number 1, it's a brake and it slows down the rate of absorption of glucose. But number 2, fiber, when it gets further down into your digestive system, actually becomes food for your microbiome. Your microbiome can then take those fiber molecules, cut them into glucose molecules, absorb them, use them for energy, replicate, and then create short chain fatty acids that then go and help other tissues. Your microbiome is actually critically important in this equation of digestive biochemistry. And when you remove it, you're doing a number of detrimental things to the overall digestive process. And then number three, when it gets to the actual prepackaged orange juice that you buy, it might be fresh squeezed orange juice that doesn't have anything added to it, and that would be ideal. But oftentimes these orange juices might have other artificial sweeteners added to them. They might have coloring, they might have preservatives, and before you know it, you might be taking on a bunch of refined and or sort of non-natural ingredients that could end up increasing your chronic disease risk.
Yeah, let's talk about some of those non-natural ingredients, though. A lot of these diabetic-friendly foods are marketed as having no sugar. They do have the sugar alternatives in there because they don't have carbs, because there's no sugar. I mean, what is your take on these? Are these a healthier option, or is this really kind of a trap setting somebody up for a health disaster, in your opinion?
I think it's a stepping stone to kind of de-addicting yourself from the standard American diet. So the standard American diet is hyper palatable. And what that means is that food manufacturers have put in a number of ingredients that significantly increase dopamine production inside of your brain so that you eat the food, you get this massive dopamine release and you're like, oh my God, that was good. I want more. Fritos, Cheetos, Doritos, those are perfect examples. Like you eat them and all of a sudden your tongue lights up and you're like, oh my God, this is incredible. Sugary cereals, the exact same way. The idea is that when you eat foods that contain hyperpalatable ingredients, including what are known as SOS, salt, oil, and sugar, these three ingredients are known to trigger your brain to say, oh, that's good, give me some more. And so food manufacturers know this, they take advantage of it, and they put that stuff inside of your food so that you'll go back to the grocery store, you'll buy more, and they'll make a lot of money off of you. Instead of playing that game, I recommend playing a game where you either minimize your intake of those ingredients or you eliminate them altogether. And what you will find is that when you do that, you can slow down the amount of dopamine that's being produced by your brain. You're still going to be a happy person, don't get me wrong. You're not going to eliminate dopamine production, but you'll get to a point where the food that you're eating doesn't elicit very large amounts of dopamine that get you into an addictive eating cycle. Instead, it elicits a normal physiological release of dopamine. And that's a good thing because it'll say, oh, you know what? Those chickpeas are pretty tasty. Oh, wow, that sweet potato is pretty tasty, right? But it's not going to cause a sort of dangerous addictive eating cycle. For people that are living with diabetes, they've been told that, white table sugar is bad for you and it's going to cause a high blood glucose release, which is a true statement. So instead, use aspartame, because aspartame is not even a sugar. It's actually a dipeptide. It's 2 amino acids. And that's better for you because it's not going to cause your blood glucose to spike. You know what? Another thing that you could do is you could use stevia, because stevia is not going to cause your blood glucose to spike at all. And the truth is that, yeah, from a glucose spiking issue, it's not going to cause your blood glucose to do weird things. But you know what it's going to do? It's going to elicit your brain to stimulate high dopamine production. And again, we want to get out of that cycle, because when you are producing excess dopamine, it puts you into a state where you become biologically addicted to specific foods. And when that biological addiction grows over the course of time, it can cause disastrous effects, as you know firsthand, right? So we want to set ourselves up for success. And if you want to use the stevias and the aspartames of the world as a mechanism to sort of ramp down your production or your consumption of hyper-processed palatable foods, that's okay. But use it as a temporary stopgap to go from standard American diet to slightly less refined diet, and then eventually to a diet that contains predominantly whole foods. And when you do it that way, you can de-addict yourself from the food manufacturers of the world that are really out there because they just want more money.
Well said, man. Let's talk about this with the time that we have remaining. I mean, there is such a huge amount of money out there that's being spent every year to treat diabetes. And it seems like, everything that we've been talking about here today in terms of a more natural approach and eating a healthier diet filled with more whole foods, less processed foods, right? Going toward that plant-based diet. It seems like that can have a pretty powerful effect. How does that compare to the traditional diabetes treatments that are currently on the market?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the traditional diabetes treatments that currently exist on the market are, there's a number of them. You can take the sort of American Diabetes Association approach, which is where they don't necessarily confine you into eating a specific number of grams of carbohydrate or fat or protein. They basically say, we're going to offer you sort of diabetes-friendly recipes. And then when you go and look at those recipes, they tend to be low carbohydrate, and they tend to be high in animal protein, and they tend to be high in saturated fat. So again, those foods, even though they have a stamp of approval from the American Diabetes Association, I'll tell you this right now, those are insulin resistance causing foods. And I'll stand behind that with every ounce of my being. Then you go into the low carbohydrate world, and the low carbohydrate world says carbohydrates are bad for you. Eat a ketogenic diet or carnivore diet because that's a way to lower your blood glucose. And again, there's a lot of endocrinologists and a lot of diabetes specialists that swear by those diets, because when you eat those foods, guess what happens? You lose weight. And when you lose weight, guess what happens? Your blood glucose falls and your blood pressure falls and your triglyceride level falls. And so what ends up happening is that there's people who consume these low carbohydrate diets and they get really good results within the first 6 to 12 months. They see weight loss, lower blood pressure, lower total cholesterol, lower triglycerides, lower A1C, lower fasting glucose, lower post-meal blood glucose, less medication use. And they go, oh my God, I'm transformed. I feel like $1 million. But the problem, what they don't recognize is that the short-term effects that they're experiencing over the course of 6 to 12 months or so, on average, tend to become very problematic in the long term because they're increasing the amount of insulin resistance with every bite of food. However, that insulin resistance isn't really manifesting itself because they're in an active weight loss process. As soon as the weight loss stops, as soon as the weight loss plateaus, you get to a point where the amount of insulin resistance which is built under the surface, which has caused a traffic jam inside of your liver and muscle, has now become so problematic that it manifests in a number of different ways. Number one, Dr. Baxter Montgomery will tell you the exact same thing, which is that people who eat low carbohydrate diets have alarmingly high LDL cholesterol, and that is not a good thing. Okay, so many biomarkers fall in the right direction, but LDL cholesterol goes up, and make no mistake about it, high LDL cholesterol increases your risk for a future cardiac event. Period. End of story. You do not want high LDL cholesterol, and a ketogenic diet or a low carbohydrate diet is definitely one path to getting there very quickly. Number two, having high LDL cholesterol can increase your risk for atherosclerosis, which is the hardening of blood vessels, which can then translate to increased blood pressure down the road. You don't want that either. Number three, people who eat a ketogenic diet or a low carbohydrate diet often end up losing weight, plateauing, and then gaining the weight right back over the course of time, because it is very challenging to maintain a low carbohydrate diet over the course of time. If you look in the research studies and you look for what happens to people over the course of many years, it's very hard to find those studies because most of the people involved in those studies drop out because eating a ketogenic diet is not a sustainable path to long-term health. And as a result of that, these studies just don't last. Some of the studies are 14 weeks. Some of the studies are 3 months. Some of the studies are 6 months. Some of the studies get to a year, but after that point, you'll find that the dropout rate is so high that the study was actually stopped. So if you ask me, what I care about is I want two things simultaneously. Number one, I want short-term results, meaning I want your blood glucose to improve in a short period of time. I want your body weight to improve, your blood pressure to improve, and your cholesterol to improve in a short period of time. But in addition to that, I want the long-term results to also stick. I want them to become even better than the short-term results. And I want to know that if whatever you're doing today can translate to something that's even better a year down the road or 5 years down the road or 12 years down the road, then you're doing something good. I do not want you to get into a cycle where you're doing something that only works in the short term and doesn't work in the long term, because that is not sustainable. And ketogenic diets and low carbohydrate diets and the American Diabetes Association diet cause such profound insulin resistance that they are not sustainable in the long term, and they're going to lead to long-term, potentially disastrous consequences.
Speaking of that, kind of along the same lines here, Ozempic. I mean, you're talking about things that work for weight loss and doctors swearing by it. A lot of doctors getting aboard that train now. What is your take on it? I know that on masteringdiabetes.org, you guys did a blog on Ozempic. I'm curious to get your thoughts.
Yeah, Ozempic is, again, it's a phenomenal Band-Aid in the short term. For those of you who don't know exactly what Ozempic is, it's basically what's called a GLP-1 receptor agonist. It is a type of medication that was originally designed for people who are living with type 2 diabetes to help them lower their blood glucose. And what researchers found is that Ozempic and other GLP-1 agonists are very effective at helping you lose weight. In fact, the weight loss effects that you get from GLP-1 receptor agonists are so good that studies show that over a course of a 68-week period, you can lose up to 17% of your original body weight. That's huge. Imagine taking 17% of your body weight off of you right now. You can do the math on your side, but we're talking about 20, 30, 40, 50 pounds of weight loss over the course of a 68-week period, and that's a good thing. And then, and again, like I said earlier, when you lose weight, that is the single most powerful thing that you can do to lower your cholesterol and lower your blood pressure and lower your blood glucose, and that is a good thing. But here's the problem. Ozempic and other GLP-1 receptor agonists, they function by two things. Number one, they trick your digestive system into thinking that it is full, and they activate stretch receptors to think that there's something inside of them, even though there isn't anything. And then your digestive system sends a signal up to your brain, directly up to your hypothalamus, and says, hey, hypothalamus, take on less food. And your hypothalamus says, okay, cool, appetite down. And then number two, it directly signals to your hypothalamus and says, hey, appetite, come down. And as a result of that, you as the end user don't feel hungry. When you don't feel hungry, you don't eat very much food. When you don't eat very much food, you end up losing weight. It's a very elegant mechanism. But the problem is that number one, GLP-1 receptor agonists cause nausea, vomiting, and extensive GI dysfunction. There was actually some papers that are coming out now, or some stories that I've read recently that says that GLP-1 receptor agonists are now causing what's called stomach paralysis, otherwise known as gastroparesis. And it is a huge problem because people who live with gastroparesis have a very difficult time emptying their stomach. It is extremely painful, and it makes it so that every single meal you consume causes pain and makes it so that it is very challenging to eat food. It literally will sideline your entire life because your stomach no longer functions properly. And GLP-1 receptor agonists are thought to increase the risk of gastroparesis. That's a problem. Number three, GLP-1 receptor agonists are very expensive. And when I say expensive, I mean that they can cost between $900 and $1,500 per month for a once a week injection. Okay. If you have that kind of expendable income and you want to use this, that's your decision. But I don't recommend it because, again, you get the side effects. They're extremely expensive. And then number four, when you use GLP-1 receptor agonists, they only are effective when you use them. There was a trial known as a step 4 trial, which basically said, what happens to people if we put them on a GLP-1 receptor agonist and then we remove them from the GLP-1 receptor agonist? Do they lose weight and then keep that weight off, or do they lose weight and gain it back? And what they found was that they took, I'm trying to think, it was about 700 people in a step 4 trial, and they basically got them to lose up to 7% of their body weight over the first 20 weeks. And then at that 20-week marker, they split them into two groups. Group number one got a placebo, and group number two continued taking the semaglutide, which is the GLP-1 receptor agonist. Now, what ended up happening is the people who continued to take the GLP-1 receptor agonist ended up continuing to lose weight, and they got to about 15% lower body weight over the course of the entire study. So that was a good thing because they continued to lose weight. But the people who were switched to a placebo, basically a fake pill, ended up gaining the weight back. And as a result of that, there was a huge difference of their body weight at the end of the study. So the people who took semaglutide and then ended up switching gained their weight right back again. And that's a huge problem because this is not designed to be a long-term solution. And if you only take it for some period of time and lose weight, but you don't change your habits, and then you end up gaining the weight right back, what's the point? It doesn't make any sense. So what I would recommend is that you can stimulate the same mechanism that GLP-1 receptor agonists stimulate inside of your digestive system simply by eating foods that are fiber rich. I described those foods earlier because the presence of fiber distends your digestive system, and it causes those stretch receptors to pick up the phone and make a phone call and call your hypothalamus and say, hey, there's something inside of me, slow down. And your hypothalamus goes, cool, sweet. And then it lowers its appetite. And by doing it that way, you actually naturally stimulate GLP-1 production. And that's a good thing because it causes your brain to slow down. You end up taking on less calories. And as a result of that, you end up losing weight and losing weight naturally. And that will always win.
There are two nagging questions out there that I want to ask because I think they're fascinating and they're hodgepodge and they'll just tie everything together. You just mentioned fiber, and people who are eating a raw diet in particular are getting gobs of it. When it comes to eating a raw diet and diabetes, have there been any studies done on this to show that there's a positive effect that they could have, or do we just not know?
That's a good question. From what I've read, I have not found any studies that specifically document the effect of a raw diet versus a cooked food plant-based diet. I can tell you from my experience and also from the experience of many other people that we've worked with, the raw food diet is probably the most insulin sensitizing way of eating that exists. In other words, there's probably no other way of eating that can make you more insulin sensitive than a raw food diet. I have observed that by eating cooked foods, my insulin requirements go up just a little bit, and other people have also demonstrated the same thing. But even then, by eating more cooked foods, including whole grains and including legumes and starchy vegetables, insulin requirements might go up a little bit, but you're still in an incredibly insulin sensitive state. So there's really nothing to worry about from what I know.
Then final question, an actionable item as it were. If you're going shopping with somebody who's ready to reverse their diabetes and they say, Cyrus, I need 5 foods to put in my shopping cart. Give me the first 5 that come to mind that could give me the biggest benefit. What are going to be the 5 you point them toward?
Number 1, bananas. Number 2, mangoes. Number 3, chickpeas. Number 4, potatoes of any color, any shape, any size. And number 5, quinoa. I'll say that again. Bananas, mangoes, chickpeas, potatoes of any color, shape, size, and quinoa. Put those into your food, into your diet, if you haven't already been eating them. They're all very tasty. They're all calorie dense. They're all incredibly insulin sensitizing foods. I think you're going to love them. And those happen to be my five favorite foods. So
That sounds delicious. I'll be over for dinner this evening.
perfect. Sounds like a plan.
Cyrus Khambatta, Mastering Diabetes. Check him out, masteringdiabetes.org. Pick up the book, sign up for the courses, get in on the coaching, and just do your blood sugar a world of good. Cyrus Khambatta, thanks, man.
Thank you, Chuck. I appreciate you inviting me here, and I hope this was very helpful.
Thanks for watching. If you got value out of this video, please like it, subscribe, and hit the notification button.